Hi folks, this is Charles and welcome back to the final part of my video series on online gaming communities from the lenses of community management, game design, and society. You'll have to pardon my setup this time around because I'm trying to conserve energy by recording this on my tablet in the air-conditioned common area. This week we'll be exploring game design patterns for building friendships based on the work of Daniel Cook from Sparfox. Another special thing we'll be doing this time is that we'll also be comparing his findings to a case study of a player's experiences in an MMORPG, my experiences. I played a game called Dofus over several months as a teenager in the mid-aughts, and I think it'll be a good example of how these patterns were used effectively even before this piece wrote these ideas down. The general model. To start, there's a general model of building friendships that Cook describes in his article based around 4 key factors. The 4 key factors are proximity, similarity, reciprocity, and disclosure. When these are present, friendships tend to form. Cook describes these factors generally so as to not be limited by a specific game genre, whether it can fit an MMORPG like Dofus or an online multiplayer fighting game. Let's start with proximity. Proximity. Put players in serendipitous situations where they regularly encounter other players. Allow them to recognize one another across multiple play sessions. Close proximity and repeat encounters leads to intimacy. You want a good amount of closeness, but not to be too dense either. Examples of these include persistent spaces, Minecraft servers, MMO shards, persistent sessions, and so on. Dofus is an isometric MMORPG where players can chat with each other in shared space. Each tile in a world of tiles makes a room where players can speak in public chat. There's wild areas for fighting enemies, gathering areas for people to sell their wares, and quieter areas for in-between. I met one friend who was the Enaripsa class, that's the fairy class, sitting in a field where she said hi to me, and we formed a friendship that would connect me to her guild and many more adventures thereafter. Next up is similarity. Similarity. Create shared identities, values, contexts, and goals that ease alignment and connection. Similarity is based around shared experiences, generally struggles. It could be in games, such as requiring a certain level cap or setting a certain amount of quests accomplished, or a quiz. In real life, it can come from boot camp, hazing, or lived experiences. Similarity ideally should be visible. It can also be based around shared interests, or perceived shared interests. It can come from similar aspirations, however modest. Or, for certain kinds of people, it can come from universal relatability, applying beyond race, gender, and sexuality. Similarity in Dofus. The game had us express ourselves through character designs, so we could be drawn to each other's interest in aesthetics, like having primary versus non-primary colors, or tough intimidating characters versus playful friendly characters. Or it could be based around our playstyles, like role-playing versus power gaming. Later, as we got to know each other, we could bond further on things like our Zanga or DeviantArt accounts. That's the mid-aughts for you. Reciprocity. Enable exchanges, not necessarily material, that are bidirectional, with benefits to both parties. With repetition, this builds relationships. The general reciprocity loop follows the following pattern: action, cost and benefit, feedback, update mental model, and choice, back and forth between the two parties. To note, these exchanges are not necessarily material. There are several scenarios for inappropriate reciprocation. One is player B ignores the overture. Communication is messy, so if it was low enough cost, player A may attempt again. Another scenario is player B reciprocates but does so inappropriately. They give too much or too little. They give the wrong sort of response. The negotiation of norms is going poorly, and the relationship may end. In another scenario, player B explicitly rejects the overture. The relationship momentum falters and may degrade. And in another scenario, player B uses the overture to harm player A. Any relationship begins to degrade rapidly at that point. Asymmetry. People are often in asymmetrical relationships as much as they don't wish to admit it, like the relationship between a parent and a child, or sometimes the relationship with a significant other. It is very hard for relationships to be 100% symmetrical, so many relationships end up being asymmetrical. Friendship development. Friendships can develop over time. Investment increases for friendships until forming deeper relationships where they cost too much. Some eventually reach a point where no cost is too high, such as marriages, families, or some long-term friendships. Reciprocity patterns. Emotes or signaling, chat, trade, mutual support, and so on. Some examples of reciprocity anti-patterns are zero-sum interactions, trade scamming, lack of predictability, or extreme power differentials. In Dofus, these patterns would manifest in multiple ways. We had emotes for laughing, crying, blowing kisses, and such. There was aforementioned public chat in each room, and private chat. There'd also be semi-public chat in rooms with low foot traffic. There was cooperation. Players could opt in to support each other in battles as a team, and share their loot as a result. Also, the different classes would have different roles of DPS, tank, and healer, prompting cooperation. We did have a guild, and eventually I became in charge of one I was a part of. And later, I would have an online girlfriend whom I would chat with while running up the phone bill, which led to an in-game marriage at a church with an in-game wedding ring accessory. Really made use of those few months of that game. Finally, disclosure. Disclosure. Further grow trust in the relationship through disclosing vulnerability, testing boundaries, etc. Deeper relationships will lead to riskier, trust-building decisions, disclosing new or secret information. To note, games that lack the tools to disclose personal info between two people will never facilitate deep relationships. Risk. All that is to say that risk is inherent to disclosure. Bearing the soul makes a game move beyond entertainment, and fear of rejection or harm is immense. What constitutes disclosure is highly specific to a given person and relationship. How much players determine what is highly sensitive disclosure is largely subjective and not uniform, so it is not the role of the designer to decide. Disclosure patterns. Rich communication tools that allow for opt-in chat, and rich tools for opting out. Quiet opportunities to talk. Mechanics to encourage personal disclosure safely. Also, mechanics that loosen inhibitions, such as silly outfits, alcohol, physical interactions, and so on. Anti-patterns. A large amount revolve around premature disclosure where the player hasn't opted in yet, such as premature disclosure of real names, voice, location, real-life physical appearance, or purchased items. Other anti-patterns also involve highlighting dissimilarities, or non-in-game similarities, or relying on real-world default similarities. Dofus had lots of this. We had opt-in chat. We could block people when someone was being a troll. We could dress in fun outfits. And we had quiet spaces for private conversations. We also never had to disclose our real names, locations, or voices if we didn't want to. To note, there was no in-game voice chat back then. Metrics. There's ways to measure how many friendship goals are being achieved. Cook defines the main metrics that are defined as the following. Co-play, playing together, not just chatting. Repeated co-play, playing together more than once. Friendship behaviors, initiating or lengthening co-play, inviting or staying in group. Challenges of metrics. Cook notes two key challenges of metrics. 1. The challenges of strangers. Most big games gather large amounts of strangers. How do you get them to mix well? Number 2. Challenge of co-play number 2 experiences. Players co-play once with a stranger relatively well, but it's rare to get players to co-play a second time. A tough problem. Caveats. Most friendships are going to be acquaintances. It's hard to get people to go up the friendship funnel. Don't force or suggest friendships or connections. Let them be opt-in rather than be overly suggestive as the designer. Be wary of unexplained increased engagement. There may be negative arguments happening instead of positive engagement. Additionally, there are the general problems of potential for griefing, harassment, and abuse in communities. Conclusion. Cook gives a pep talk at the end of his article stating, "The facilitation of meaningful relationships between other human beings is a noble design goal," and games are uniquely suited to facilitating relationships. Furthermore, he emphasizes the promise and responsibility given to designers to help people form friendships. It's, quote, "To make friends, you need multiple people, a reason to bring them together, and some form of repeated, mutually beneficial interaction. Multiplayer games have all these elements. Every piece of a game can be designed to remove walls and build social connections. What an opportunity!" Cook continues, "As game designers, this is one of our great powers and responsibilities. We design these machines. We are responsible for the growth and nurturing of the machine's players and communities that they form. The human process of friendship formation is an essential game design tool. Wield it wisely." This was certainly true for Dofus. I formed relationships, connections, and had stories and experiences I'll remember for the rest of my life, formed with real people. The majority of these experiences only happened in a span of about 3 to 4 months. Talk about a shotgun wedding. And so much had to do with the mechanics that enabled us. Additionally, I think a lot also had to do with the culture around online games at the time. Not as many folks were playing, so it was a less dense online population. Also, not many folks playing were in a climate of distrust, and we are now more worried about abuse of these social systems for malicious purposes. And people's attitudes are harder to change than a game's design. You can't put the genie back in the bottle. But there's now new kinds of experiences that are enabled by the times. With more accessible rich voice and video chat features, there's more gathering places, more types of games, and game communities, many of them free or otherwise accessible, for good and for ill. And more discussions around digital privacy, healthy boundaries, mental health, and representation. And that's it for this series. I've learned so much. It's been a wild ride, and I hope you got something out of this too. There's so many takeaways that I'll certainly be unpacking them for quite some time. If anything, I've learned so much more of the weight of how much power and responsibility there is with any community formation, whether it's for kindness, coziness, friendships, or our otherwise worthwhile attention. For the betterment of all our communities, as individuals and as creators, as Cook says, let's wield these tools wisely. Stay soft, stay strong, and I'll see you next time. Daniel Cook is Chief Creative Officer at Spryfox, where they've recently released Cozy Grove. And I'm Charles. I'm a graduating master's student at NYU, a game designer, a narrative designer, and event organizer. I'm into all these things like coziness and communities. I hope to see you again soon. Bye bye for now.